President Trump's efforts to send the National Guard into blue cities reaches the Supreme Court after an appeals panel blocks a deployment to Chicago. Plus, the administration's invitation to 9 colleges to join a higher education compact falls flat, with none taking the deal as the deadline passes, and many outright rejecting it.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleague, editorial board member Colin Levy. There are now parallel legal cases playing out in the federal courts over President Trump's orders for the National Guard to go into Chicago, as well as Portland, Oregon. Trump had cited a section of law letting the president federalize members of state National Guard if there is a danger of invasion by a foreign nation, a rebellion, or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, or if the president is unable with the irregular forces to execute the laws of the United States. District courts in both of those cases had blocked the White House's efforts. And then on Monday, an appeals panel of the Ninth Circuit allowed the Portland deployment to proceed, saying this: some of these protests have been peaceful, but many have turned violent. Protesters have threatened federal law enforcement officers and the building. That panel suggesting that met the criteria in the law for federalizing and deploying those National Guard forces. That was only days after a panel of the Seventh Circuit went in the other direction in Chicago, saying that a protest does not become a rebellion, quote, merely because of sporadic and isolated incidents of unlawful activity or even violence committed by rogue participants in the protest, unquote. Both of those cases, Colin, are now being appealed, and the Chicago one has reached the United States Supreme Court, which could issue a ruling on its emergency docket at any time. But maybe the place to start is what is happening on the ground. My understanding is that the argument in Chicago is centered around this immigration facility in Broadview, a suburb. What's been happening out there?
Yeah, Broadview is really one of the big hotspots for protest activity in Chicago. I think you have a situation there where protesters have been just gathering for weeks near the ICE facility, and some of the protests have, devolved into pretty bad clashes with ICE agents. There's been tear gas sprayed and some other crowd control methods that ICE agents used, I think including rubber bullets, that definitely made things look pretty riled up over there. Obviously, those things have landed some pretty dramatic looking pictures on the front page of local newspapers. So, I think the fact that we're looking at all of those details, and all of the drama on the front pages of the newspaper here, sort of made people think that the decisions coming out of the courts might go a different way. But what I think is interesting here, Kyle, is as we look at the decisions coming out of the Seventh Circuit and also out of Portland, is that they're really very fact specific. The Seventh Circuit decision, I think, is interesting because it was addressing, as you said, the question of whether or not the president has the authority to federalize the Guard. And in the Seventh Circuit, you had a unanimous ruling by a 3-judge panel, and the panel was made up of judges from Bush 41, from Obama, and from the last Trump administration. And the panel ruled that in this case, there's not enough evidence that the Illinois protest activity was such a hindrance or so problematic that it required the engagement of a federalized National Guard. So, the government was making a similar argument here as it was in Portland, basically saying that the president has this authority to federalize the Guard, even though Governor Pritzker and Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson are opposed to it because there's some version of rebellion against the authority of the federal government. But you really have to look at the facts at hand. And the Seventh Circuit made a point to say that the word rebellion has to be very carefully parsed here. A protest is not the same as a rebellion. It has to be more than civil disobedience, even more than sporadic flares of bad behavior. It really has to rise to the level of being an actual national security threat.
To the point about the facts on the ground, again, that third prong in the law is that the president can federalize and deploy these state National Guard troops if he is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. So it is kind of, parallel universes if you read the filings in these cases. One side is saying that there has been some sporadic violence, for example, but that has been taken care of by the local and state law enforcement that are there. The federal government and its filing now to the Supreme Court making the argument that it is more systematic in creating difficulties for federal officers, ICE operations, and so forth. So, with respect to this facility in Broadview, the federal government is telling the Supreme Court justices that it's an intake and processing center for the area. Since September, protesters have blocked government vehicles from entering or exiting the facility, slashed the tires of government vehicles, and obstructed nearby roads. The other thing that is interesting about this distinction of the facts on the ground, Colin, to my mind, is that you also assume that the president and the federal government have the ability to respond to what they perceive as threats of danger or threat that something that it looks like right now to be a protest, a sometimes violent protest, maybe sporadically violent, but the worry that that could get worse. I mean, it makes some sense if the authorities in charge are able to act before it really spirals out of control. And by the way, if you are the president of the United States, you have a national view. You may be aware of real unrest at an ICE facility in Portland. And before you start moving ICE resources into another city like Chicago, you may have the thought to try to make sure that what is happening in Portland is not what is coming next to Chicago. So that would be an argument again for acting and moving in the kind of backup and federal resources before maybe there is a record on the ground, a court record where you can say that there's no following of federal law anymore outside this facility, this ICE facility, and wherever the city may be. On the other hand, the federal government is making the argument to the Supreme Court that this is a call for the president to make, and it is not supposed to be micromanaged by panels of judges or even a lone district court judge sitting somewhere in a courthouse. So this is a piece of the filing from the U.S. government to the justices. It says a federal district court lacks not only the authority but also the competence to wrest control of the military chain of command from the commander in chief and to adjudicate whether the governor of Illinois, rather than the president, should be in ultimate command of particular guardsmen after the president has called them into federal service, unquote. And Colin, I mean, there's some persuasive force to that argument as well. On the other hand, does that mean that, on the other hand, the law does include these stipulations that the president is supposed to be able to federalize the Guard if 1, 2, or 3 is happening? Congress meant that to mean something, and so I have a hard time thinking that judges have complete, no power to review any sort of effort by the president to pretextually deploy these kinds of forces. So I don't know. I mean, I'll throw it to you, but it'll be interesting to see how the justices now parse those arguments and find their way to some kind of a decision.
No, exactly. I mean, it has to be, judges have to have the power to determine whether or not the facts in a particular case, how the law applies to those particular facts. That is their job. Insofar as, the violence and the unrest at these protests on the ground has been problematic. I mean, politically speaking, I think there's a lot of blame to go around here. I mean, I think, Trump has really been enjoying trolling on this issue and throwing out controversial posts on social media, talking about Shypocalypse now and with helicopters and, suggesting that, cities like Chicago or Portland are war zones that require the attention of federal troops. I mean, those things are really intended to get the goat of Chicagoans, of Portlandians, of local officials, and they serve to kind of like whip up a frenzy, and some of that does play out in these protests. And I think, unfortunately, what happens is that the governors and the local officials actually end up making it worse. I think they end up sort of helping him along on that path of saying, hey, we really need to bring in, federal law enforcement here because we're not getting enough help from local law enforcement. So you have a situation where you've got J.B. Pritzker, you've got Brandon Johnson, both of them Democrats, who have their own political constituencies to worry about, and they're also, J.B. Pritzker, may be running for president sometime soon, and so he's got his own national profile in mind. And he's coming up and saying, the administration's attempts to use the Illinois and Texas National Guard are Trump's invasion. He called it Trump's invasion, right? And you've had Brandon Johnson say that the deployment is a war on Chicago and that, President Trump is an authoritarian. And that he's throwing grandmothers in the back of vans, and the lingo going around here is abductions, right? Everyone's talking about abductions. They've seen abductions of gardeners and abductions of people near Home Depot, and the language I think is really controversial and problematic because you then have Brandon Johnson coming in and issuing executive orders that tell the police department not to assist, with immigration raids, and not to assist ICE agents. And that's really a problem because all of a sudden you have a situation where Trump's narrative is being bolstered. If you have protesters attacking an ICE facility, attacking ICE agents, and the local police are not going to help, or they're going to do a bare minimum in terms of protecting the peace, or doing their jobs, then it seems like, oh, well, maybe someone has to come in and protect the ICE agents if the Chicago police won't do it. Well, maybe it's not so outrageous to ask the National Guard to do it. So I think that's where it lands us, and as a legal matter, it's certainly a tricky one. I'll be interested to see where the Supreme Court comes down on that.
In the political realm, I'd second that. It does seem like both sides here almost want this fight, and they are relishing this fight. Those statements from the governor of Illinois and the mayor of Chicago, it seems to me, are intended to have the effect of riling up the protesters, feeding into these arguments. It seems to me if they didn't want Trump to deploy the National Guard of Chicago, one thing you could do, J.B. Pritzker, you could get enough, state police forces mustered that you could really protect that ICE facility and make sure there is not the kind of record created where the federal government can go to court and make the argument that they can't enforce federal law because they, for Pete's sake, can't get the federal law enforcement cars in and out of this detention facility. It seems like that would be a statesman-like approach to dealing with that problem. On the other hand, Colin, it does seem like Trump, beyond the protection of these federal agents and these federal facilities, he's constantly talking about cleaning up these cities. He seems to be talking about local crime a lot of the time, street crime, in a way that he has the power to do, to send National Guard to deal with those kinds of things, perhaps in the District of Columbia, which is a federal district under ultimate authority of the United States government. But I don't think he does have the authority to do in places like Portland and Chicago. And by the way, that gets us also to the third legal argument that is percolating, which is the use of these National Guard forces in the view of at least one federal judge in California to engage in domestic law enforcement activities, in his view, in violation of the Posse Comitatus law. That was a ruling by federal judge Charles Breyer that is also being appealed by the Trump administration. But part of the argument is that the National Guard was deployed to Chicago initially with claims similar to what you're seeing in Portland and Chicago, and then ended up doing all sorts of other things, including, running traffic checkpoints and crowd control, traffic control for immigration raids, 150 miles, one of them, on a marijuana farm outside of downtown Los Angeles. So again, the ruling by Judge Breyer was a violation of the Posse Comitatus law. He has ordered the federal government to desist from those kinds of things. But Colin, that's also part of what complicates this story is the Trump administration would get much less resistance, I think, to this idea of sending the National Guard in to protect federal agents and to protect federal resources, federal buildings. If it were clear that that's all those troops would be asked to do, but it seems like the White House takes a much broader view of what protect federal agents means, and in the White House's view, that might mean, tagging along to some kind of immigration raid far from these kinds of ICE facilities, because as long as there's some kind of ICE activity happening, the National Guard is protecting it.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's the big concern here, right? Is that all of this is just sort of a backdoor to doing the law enforcement activities that President Trump said he wanted to do to begin with. When he first started talking about Chicago, as you say, in the aftermath of having sent the National Guard in to do police activities in Washington, D.C. And yes, posse comitatus prevents the military from doing domestic law enforcement. I mean, we know that's that's why he's sort of doing this end run here, and to sort of treat this big military presence, that's walking the streets as a way to scare criminals back into their hidey holes, and then watch all the violent crimes in the city decline, and then, claim that it's been, a big success, and he's managed to get rid of all of the criminal elements and all of the crime problems that these big progressive cities have been facing for years, and which have really been very intractable. And by the way, that part is undeniable. I mean, the big city, big progressive blue city crime problems have been intractable. They're an enormous problem. They have been an enormous problem in Chicago, in Portland, and other places. And, a lot of cities, they're so bad that in many cases they're trying to make things seem like they're getting better in some cases, by just changing the metrics, by, we know that sometimes these crimes go unreported because there's so very little policing of it that the people don't even think there's much point in reporting the crimes. So all of that that's being used, I think, as a pretense for law enforcement is problematic. I do want to just talk, though, to sort of go out on a nonpartisan limb and say that, I really do, from the states' rights perspective, appreciate any governor's defense of their prerogative as a state. And I don't think we should be celebrating, bringing the National Guard in to substitute for basic law enforcement responsibilities that have been the province for the states for a long time. So, I do give a bit of credit to that hometown fight spirit. I think no matter what governor it comes from, they don't like being stepped on by the federal government. And I think conservative principles should support that instinct. It's just that, when the instinct becomes a big, social media campaign that's, meant to double as political advertising, I think we're just making the situation progressively worse. And, Donald Trump knows all that. That's the world he lives in.
Let's turn to the Trump administration's higher education compact, offered initially to 9 universities. On a previous episode, we went through the details, some of the proposals in this document, sorting them out, broadly ranging from free speech on campus, institutional neutrality, free tuition for students taking STEM majors, a tuition freeze. Colin, notable now that the deadline initially that the Trump administration had held out for responses has passed. 7 of these 9 universities seem to have rejected it. There's one that is still maybe a question mark, but some pretty interesting statements from these colleges. So here, example is Vanderbilt's chancellor. Our North Star has always been that academic freedom, free expression, and independence are essential for universities to make their vital and singular contributions to society. He also said, we believe that research awards should be made based on merit alone. I take him to mean scientific merit, the merit of those individual projects and grant applications, not broader questions about whether any institution that those researchers may work at may have signed some sort of compact on institutional neutrality. Here's the president of Dartmouth. I do not believe that a compact with any administration is the right approach to achieve academic excellence, as it would compromise our academic freedom, our ability to govern ourselves, and the principle that federal research funds should be awarded to the best, most promising ideas, unquote. Colin, what do you make of this pretty clear, unanimous so far response from these university leaders?
Yeah, I mean, I think the rejection of the compact is pretty interesting and pretty telling because many of the colleges that have declined to participate are schools that are very much on board with the Trump administration's requests in certain areas, including limiting race preferences and hiring and admissions, preventing anti-Semitism on campus, trying to create environments of free inquiry and debate, making sure there's some viewpoint diversity with conservative faculty members or conservative students. You've now had the University of Arizona, Vanderbilt, both declined the deal. Both of those schools have really been very much on board, I think, with what the Trump administration's vision is for an environment on college campuses that encourages learning and civic debate. So it's really notable that the schools are saying, even still, even if we are aligned with those ideas like institutional neutrality and these other good things, we just don't want to sign on to a plan where the government is overseeing us like a kind of nanny, checking in on whether or not, we're preventing grade inflation and whether or not our metrics are lining up with what they think it should be. It just doesn't seem very appealing to these schools. And some of those quotes you read from the letters, I think, were really interesting too, because they're all talking about the pursuit of excellence. And I think merit and meritocracy and excellence, and these are some of the big touchstones, the watchwords that the Trump administration has been going for, especially as we talk about how those schools sort through their admissions and their hiring processes. The same should really apply to how the money is allocated for research. So if MIT is putting up its research proposals for federal money, and they're saying, hey, look, we're completely comfortable competing on a level playing field. We know we've got the best ideas. Whether or not we sign up for this, we don't really need the federal preferences. I think that's a pretty powerful message. It's true coming from a lot of these schools, and the inverse is true too. If the administration is to extend this compact to other schools, and they get preferences for research, and their ideas get chosen instead of MIT's, not purely on the basis of merit, that would also seem like a bit of a wasteful exercise in federal funding. So I think I think overall it's probably a pretty good thing that they're standing on the principles that the Trump administration has been proposing for education, as I said, like meritocracy, instead of signing the compact itself.
The point about independence is the other one that struck me, just given the or else that was appended at the end of this compact, Colin. The basic idea being that they would agree to abide by all these terms, including some pretty unclear ones, as you point out, one on grade inflation. And then if the Justice Department decided that they didn't think that a certain college was living up to those terms, that college would then have to forfeit and refund all its federal money for the year of the violation, as well as giving back any private donations it accepted to anybody who asked for a refund. And that always struck me as the kind of weapon that no university, college, any institution leader would want to hand to not only this Justice Department, but any Justice Department. Who knows who's going to win the next election, who's going to be running the DOJ in the years to come. And so I guess I'm not surprised that these colleges are pretty leery of it. But then that raises the next question, which is, how does the Trump administration respond? And I guess that's an open question as we tape this, but they could go back to the drawing board with this compact and take some of the feedback from these institutions on board and try to hammer it into the kind of shape that can get to some kind of agreement with these schools, then maybe other schools. They could let this go and go back to the old kind of ways of trying to enforce civil rights laws, for example, on college campuses and get at some of those issues of free speech and discrimination in that way, including trying to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling on non-discrimination in admissions, racial preferences, the Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard case from a few years ago. Or I guess they could double down and they could say, this is the compact that we want. We want you to sign it. And we're going to look for all the leverage that we can find in every area that we work with your institutions in order to try to get you to buckle under. And Colin, I guess given the record of some of the Trump administration's other fights with colleges, including Columbia, Harvard, I guess it will be fascinating to see which, in this case, they choose.
I think that's right. I mean, look, definitely the Trump administration's default position is to double down. That's what they usually do. But in this case, it might go a little bit differently, because I think if the administration is wise, they'll recognize that they already in many ways have a significant win happening on college campuses, where really longstanding programs, norms, assumptions, from race preferences to some of these other things that they've been fighting against. Those things are all up for debate now, and debate itself, including debate about this idea, is all of a sudden taking hold on college campuses in ways that it hasn't in quite a while. And I think the better option, I think, really is to let schools, to the extent that they are embracing it. And these letters, I think, very much were clear that they were embracing many of the key tenets, especially the meritocracy, that the Trump administration has been pushing on. And let colleges run with it a little bit. I'm not to say they deserve all the benefit of the doubt, because certainly a lot of pretty obnoxious stuff has come off campus in the past few decades. But there are sort of signs that we might be optimistic about what schools are doing now, and what boards of visitors and boards of trustees are really taking an active role in watching and making sure that their colleges get the right kind of attention right now, and really are encouraging debate and free inquiry and free speech and all of those good things. So, I hope the administration will let some of that run its course before they just try to, force it on them.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.